Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Englander, and I am hearkening to you from the state of Massachusetts. I am the director, the executive director, and the founder of the Massachusetts Aggression Reduction Center at Bridgewater State University. And we are a center that conducts research and brings programming and other resources to public policy, K through 12 education, and other people who work with kids, other stakeholders. I'm very happy to be here today. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through some of the research on issues around digital behaviors and risk-taking and bullying, and how those three things sort of meld together. And what are the issues that we most often see in kids today? So you're going to have the ability to ask questions. Feel free to do that. You might want to hold them till the end, and then we'll be able to discuss them in some more detail. But I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen, and we can get started. Okay. So, as I pointed out to you earlier, my name is Dr. Elizabeth Englander. I'm the executive director of MARC. We work with about half the states in the US. I also work with Governor Charlie Baker on his Juvenile Justice Council, Advisory Council. So I'm very familiar with the work that many of you do. And I am also a very active researcher, and I'm going to be showing you some of the data that we have. So basically, just to give you a very brief idea of what it is that we do in this center, we do programming in schools, and we have lots of different programming for schools, including much of our programming is free of charge for any schools. For example, we have K through 12 curricula. We're all research-based and vetted, and this curricula is used in about half of the states in the United States. And it's a really great resource if you work with schools or anybody else who might be able to use it. We also do a lot of research. I'm going to be showing you some of that today. And we also work with other stakeholders. So we work with government. We train pediatricians. I just finished a session training judges. And it's very important to get other people up to speed on what these issues are because they affect children so profoundly. Even during the pandemic, there is a really quite a notable situation that we've been seeing in the research. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through. I just want to begin by pointing out that aggression, there are many different types of aggression, and the word bullying is really sort of chronically overused to refer to any kind of situation that hurts anybody's feelings. And that's definitely one of the biggest problems in the field right now. When we talk about something being bullying per se, we're talking about something with these four characteristics. It's a situation that is intentional, it's not an accident, it is repetitive, it's not one time, and there is a power imbalance, typically around social power. A generation ago, the power in bullying was actually often physical in nature. But today, it's most often around social power. The final characteristic is that the behavior has to have an impact. In other words, the target has to care. And you'd be surprised, it's not uncommon for kids to try to bully each other, but they may choose a target who really doesn't particularly care. And that obviously is still a situation, but it's a very different kind of situation. This is not to say that other kinds of behaviors aren't harmful to kids. I think it would be a mistake to say that. Clearly, things that happen once can be very harmful, but bullying is different. And I want to show you why. So this is sort of data that shows you the difference in the emotional impact between incidents of bullying and incidents of other kinds of problems like fighting. So you notice the other problems are not zero, they still have an impact. But the reason that we're so concerned about bullying is that the emotional impact of it is significantly greater. A lot of that has to do with the repetition. The fact that you have a kid or a group of kids who sort of set out to make a target's life miserable. And by doing that, they really have an impact because they're going after this target over and over and over again. Now, you may notice that I'm not talking about any specific behaviors. So for example, I'm not saying to you, well, if somebody posts a photo of another person, that's cyberbullying. Or if somebody trips someone in the school hallway, that's bullying. Bullying isn't defined by the behavior itself. Actually, interestingly, the behavior itself can be quite mild at times, but it's the context that these behaviors happen in that's most important. So if you have a situation where the behavior might seem pretty mild, let's say that somebody got an answer wrong in class and other people laughed at them, or a group of kids who are bullying them laughed at them. You might say, well, what's the big deal? So they laughed at you because you got one answer wrong. So what? The answer is that it might be a big deal if the context it's happening in is really important. So if they have been bullying this kid since the 3rd grade, then any action they take, like laughing, could be really impactful. And if it's part of a repeated pattern where they're going after the target, that can make it really impactful too. So it's really, really important to understand that it's not just the behavior per se, it's the context it happens in that determines how much it really impacts a target. Let's go ahead and do the first poll. I'd be interested in hearing what you all feel is the definition of cyberbullying. So let's go ahead and put up the first poll. Leslie, and let's see what people think. Leslie, why don't you go ahead and just indicate to me in the chat box when people are done and what they said. All right, I'm going to guess that something's not working, but that's okay. We're going to keep going anyway. Here's the point about the definition of cyberbullying that you might find interesting. Bullying has been really carefully defined by researchers. We know what it is, but cyberbullying has not been really well defined. It's really hard to define it precisely. If somebody, for example, does something to you and other people text it out to others or post it on social media, it could feel really repetitive, even if it's not. See, I'm looking at the results and it looks like about 2/3 of you felt that bullying happens via digital technology. That could be one of the definitions, or repeated cruelty online, but it's really hard. How do you know when something is repeated cruelty online? It's really difficult to know. So the point I'm trying to make is that while we can really define bullying precisely, it's not so easy when it comes to cyberbullying. And that may make it tough for people in the field. Now, what determines in cyberbullying if somebody is really strongly impacted? So we did this really interesting study where we looked at severe incidents and mild incidents of cyberbullying. So a severe incident might be something like, I took a nude photo and somebody, without my permission, passed it around to lots of people. Like, that would be pretty bad. A mild incident might be something like, well, you know, somebody took a photo of me and it was kind of embarrassing. It wasn't that big a deal, but it was a little embarrassing. So what determines if it's really impacted? So if the severe incident happens once, you can see that about 13% of the kids said they were really strongly impacted by it because it was pretty serious. If it happened more than once, if it began to be repeated, well, then the percentage that said that it was really impactful goes way up. But look at how interesting it is. Look at the gray bar. The people who were also being targeted at school were the most likely by far to say that this severe cyberbullying incident really impacted them. Same pattern is true with mild incidents. So when you look at mild things, things are maybe a little embarrassing, but they're not really that big a deal. If they just happen once, very few kids told us that it really impacted them seriously. If it began to happen repeatedly, then we began to see more. But even a mild incident could really impact kids who were also being targeted in school. So the takeaway from this particular study was that, again, it seems to be the context that the behavior is happening and that really matters. The context matters more than the actual behavior itself, which is really interesting. Few facts about cyberbullying that I want to give you sort of a broad view of. The first thing is it is not universal, but it's not rare either. Cyberbullying probably happens about as often as getting a traffic ticket or a speeding ticket. You may have gotten one once in your life. Maybe you have never gotten any. You might know people who get a lot of traffic tickets, but there's not really that many people like that, right? I mean, most people don't get one, or they might get one, many, many years apart. So it's sort of, that is about the frequency that you might expect to see it. It's just as common in girls as it is in boys. And in that way, it's really unique. When I started my research career, we didn't even study girls because the vast majority of aggression was happening between boys. That was really the issue. But cyberbullying and digital behaviors definitely happen in girls. And cyberbullying is not separate from the real world. It's not like its own thing that has nothing to do with what happens between kids in person. Those two things are one and the same for kids. And it's really important to understand this. Bullying is more common than cyberbullying, probably. It's a little hard to say because, like I said before, we don't really have a definition of cyberbullying. So it kind of depends how you define it. But regardless, one thing everyone does agree on is that what happens in person is really strongly related to what happens online. Few things that have changed. From 1970 to about 2000, one of the biggest changes we saw was a shift from physical and psychological bullying to overwhelmingly psychological. Today, the vast majority of bullying incidents that we track are psychological in nature. Only about 11% are actually physical in nature. So it's much more psychological than it used to be. And this is driven, no doubt, by digital technology. Other stuff that's changed is, no doubt about it, is the shift to digital technology is really quite significant. And I really can't overstate what a big influence this is. Probably the best analogy I can think of is the Industrial Revolution, in terms of something that happened to a society that changed everything about it. And I think that's very significant for kids particularly. One of the other changes is the dramatic increase in bias-based bullying and cyberbullying. So basically, we track three kinds of bullying that happens between kids online and in person. Non-bias would be things like somebody saying, "Oh, your clothes are really ugly." It has nothing to do with bias. Bias-based bullying would be bullying somebody because of their race, their ethnicity, their religion, their LGBTQ status, maybe their immigration status. Then there are some kinds of bullying that we call maybe bias, which is bullying that's really hard to tell what it is. And that's things like, you look sort of, you're funny looking, you know, and that could just be something like your ears are big, but it could also be the fact that you wear a headscarf or the fact that this color of your skin is different. So those are the three types we've looked at: bias-based, non-bias-based, and maybe bias. Since 2014, we've been tracking these types, and you can see that bias-based bullying has been increasing dramatically since 2016. And that has been a truly enormous shift and very significant, and an area of great concern to us. And we've been working quite a lot on this. Now, the pandemic has also fed bias-based bullying. The pandemic has involved bias against Asian Americans, and it's quite significant how frequently this has come up with. You know, Asian Americans are reporting thousands of incidents of psychological harassment and bullying, being coughed on or spat on, being called names like diseased or the China virus. Problems like that are very significant. Now, we've seen this in adults as well as in other kids. So, for example, students of color are significantly more likely than white students to be told don't tattle when they try to report bullying. Now, keep in mind that we push kids to report bullying quite a lot. That's one of the messages that kids consistently report they hear from adults, is that they should report bullying to an adult. But we have a really serious problem when students of color are far more likely than white students to report that an adult, when they try to report bullying, the adult says, don't tattle. Now, just so you're aware of it, we are putting out a new curriculum and new resources at Mark on bias and diversity. These were actually in the planning stages long before the pandemic, but it certainly is timely and something that we all need to focus on. All right, let's talk a little bit about resilience. So resilience is kind of the holy grail in bullying prevention. And the idea is to build up kids' abilities to cope with cruel social behaviors on their own so that they don't need to involve adults as much, and in a way that increases their social skills and their self-confidence. So the first thing I thought I would show you is what are the things in our research that show that it seem to increase vulnerability, seem to lower resilience. One of these is when problems are repeated. So anytime a problem between two kids is repeated, doesn't just happen once, kids tend to become less resilient. Second are when kids fight a lot with their friends. Now, this might sound incongruous, and at first glance, we were a little surprised by this, because I think that as adults, we tend to think that fighting has nothing to do with bullying between kids. But actually, it turns out that kids who fight a lot with their friends are kids who have sort of poor social skills in general, and they tend to struggle to have the kinds of social support that really helps them be resilient. Other things that make kids more vulnerable, when things go digital. So when something goes online, what you find is that kids tend to feel more vulnerable. Now, this one has kind of a timeline with it. What we generally find in the research is that kids tend to feel more vulnerable while the problem is happening. So while things are being posted online, it's very acute. They feel very much in distress about that. But if you ask them about bullying episodes, like 6 months or a year later, what they often say is something like, well, it was the problems that happened in person that were really the hardest part, not the problems that happened online. So that was kind of interesting. Other things that make kids vulnerable. If it's your friends who attack you. Now, Unfortunately, females are more likely to report this relative to boys, but excuse me, if the bully is somebody from your friends group, then you're significantly more likely to feel this way. Finally, what other thing that increases vulnerability is when kids have multiple issues. Now, this is particularly an issue today, I think. In the middle of this pandemic and this economic recession, kids are under a great deal of stress. So anything that increases stress, that any history of violence, any problems with depression, anxiety, family violence or abuse, substance abuse, any of these increase vulnerability. Now let's talk about the other side, which is how do we increase resiliency? So let's go ahead, Leslie, if you don't mind, and put up poll number 2. And let's look at what can adults do to actually help kids become more resilient. All right, and once people have answered, Leslie, if you could put up the results in the chat box. That would be great. So the first thing, while we're waiting for the results of that, the first thing I thought I would show you is, okay, so here's the results. What can adults do to increase resiliency? 37% of you said ensuring that the bully is punished fairly. 60% ensuring all school adults are aware, and 35% ensuring that the victim's friends are able to stick close to him or her. Okay. So I want you to keep in mind these answers. So you were sort of split between punishment and ensuring that a target's friends could stick by them closely. But also, about most of you felt that the most important thing was making sure that the school adults are aware of the situation. So let's look at what kids have actually told us about this. So the first thing I want to show you is a study where we asked kids what strategies adults recommended to them, and then what strategies they actually used when they were being bullied that was most helpful. Excuse me. So if you look at the adult recommended strategies, the first 2 answers, which were by far the most common answers, were to ignore the bully and decide the bully has no power over you. And those are kind of the same thing, just ignore the situation in general. You might notice that third place is blank. And the reason it's blank is that the first 2 answers were by far the most common ones. But in contrast now, let's look at what strategies kids said were actually helpful for them. And you might notice that their top 2 strategies were sticking with their friends. That was the top strategy, to stick with their friends. Just to show you the contrast between these, what helped when you were bullied? Punishment of the bully was one of the least helpful things. I think that's really interesting. That was your second place answer. Ensuring that all adults know about it. Sort of, I put that under school support. That was okay, but again, pretty low. But look at the contrast with those strategies and the strategy of making sure the friends stick close. So the strategy that you folks actually ranked as least useful is the strategy that kids rank as most useful. One of the things that we're going to see over and over and over again is the number one way that kids cope and build resiliency to bullying is through social support. And this is not just out of our research lab, it's out of all the researchers who look at this. There's been a remarkable amount of consistency in this. Look at social support from adults and the difference this makes. So this was a study where we asked kids how resilient they were, or we sort of ranked them based on how they were coping with the bullying, but then we asked them how connected they were with their teachers. And the kids who were in the often connected group were kids who told us they had at least one adult every year at school who they really liked and they felt like they could talk to. The other kids said that that happened to them less often, not every year. And look at the difference in resiliency. The often connected kids are significantly more resilient. Again, that gets us to the point where we're really talking about social support as being the way kids learn resiliency. And it's really interesting how incredibly consistent this is. But it's not something that adults tend to go to. And I think we have to be more aware of it as adults. Okay, so let's start looking at the digital stuff specifically and sort of how we're going to deal with this. So there are some things that complicate how well we as adults sort of cope with digital technology. One is, of course, our memory of the world that existed before technology. And I'm sure that like many of you, I, as a kid, got those letters that you were supposed to forward to 10 people and they told you all the terrible things that would happen to you if you didn't. And that still happens today through email, or not so much even email, more like texting. And it's really interesting. I also don't know how many of you remember texting using this kind of phone. Sometimes when I show this picture to people, there's somebody who raises their hand and they say, I still have this phone. Yeah, and there are some people who do, but it's unusual. Most of the time now, the phone is a smartphone. And, texting using this kind of cell phone was actually very challenging. You might remember this. To get an S, you had to hit the 7 4 times. That's pretty funny if you think about it. We had to peck out these messages. It was very, very challenging. When you think about comparing texting using this device to texting using this kind of device, it's completely different. I can just speak to my phone and it types it out and sends it for me. Totally different experience. And the hardware really dictates the behavior to a great extent. And do we as adults really appreciate what it's like to grow up in this world with social media and other things? To a great extent, I spend my career trying to understand how kids feel growing up in this world, but I think it's very challenging. I really do. I think this is not an easy time to understand anything. And understanding what it feels like to go through pre-adolescence and adolescence with social media and those kinds of pressures, I think that's incredibly difficult. So there's a couple of things that digital technology really changes, and I want to talk about those for a minute. And then we're going to start talking about risk-taking, and I'll get into all that. But let's start by talking about feelings and thoughts. So how does digital technology change your feelings? How does it change how you feel about things or about yourself? So one of the interesting things that we did was we asked kids about social media pictures. Now, one of the things that I'm sure you realize about social media pictures, and kids realize it too, is that social media pictures tend to be relentlessly ecstatic. It's always pictures of people who are sort of having the time of their lives, just hanging out. They're always thrilled, they're about to eat fabulous food, or they're on somebody's yacht, or the pictures sort of depict people who are incredibly happy. And how much do you realize that that is sort of not representative of real life, that it's kind of fake? And how much does it affect you? So we asked kids first, do you know this kind of thing is fake? And about half of them said, yeah, I know that a lot of social media pictures are fake. About half of the kids weren't sure, which is really amazing. But about half of them were pretty sure, at least a good portion of the time, it was fake. So then we went back to the kids who told us that they were pretty sure a lot of it was fake. And we said, does it still get to you emotionally? Does it make you feel bad about your own situation or your own life, even if you know it's fake? And this is what was really interesting. So about 60% of the kids who were pretty sure it was fake still really felt impacted by this. And I think that's really important. Does social media make people feel anxious? So about 67% of the kids that we studied told us that when they see what their friends are doing, it makes them really anxious. It makes them anxious about, why aren't I there with them? Or are they talking about me or thinking about me? Remember that adolescence is sort of this time of incredible self-absorption. And the idea is that everyone is fascinated in talking about you as a teenager. So it's not surprising that a teenager would say, my friends are all out together right now doing something. They're probably talking about me. Even though as an adult, we might look at that and say, they're not talking about you. Believe me, they're not that interested in you. But as teenagers, you really feel like that they are. Here's the interesting part. 31% of the kids in this study also said that they get really anxious when they don't see their friends on social media. So it kind of gets you both ways. If you see your friends on social media, it makes you anxious. And if you don't see your friends on social media, it makes you anxious. And that's really striking, I think. They're anxious when they don't see their friends because they're worried that their friends aren't sharing with them what they're doing, because again, they're worried that it's about them. So when don't users feel anxious? Really interesting. So one of the primary times when kids don't feel anxious, they do report feeling less anxious when they're totally away from screens. So like if they're doing something unrelated, like if they're a musician and they're playing their instrument, or if they're out hiking in the woods with their family, or things like that, where they're really away from the screens, that can help with anxiety. But the other thing that really feels good is when they're engaging with social media and they're being included. And so people are sending them messages or showing them posts. That really helps their anxiety a lot. So it's like social media is like this system where when you're engaging with it, you're constantly starved for that positive recognition. You get it, ping, you get a little dopamine rush and you feel wonderful. And then when you're not in that situation, you're feeling anxious about it. So you can see how this kind of psychological loop where you have the negative feelings and then you only get to the positive part when you're actually engaging will really, really draw you towards consistent use. Now, there are some things that we study in the lab that we call stupid stuff that adults don't get. And these are the kinds of things where a kid is talking to us about issues. And, you know, I might be sitting there thinking, I don't understand why this teenager feels so strongly about this. But my students who are observing might be sitting there thinking, yeah, I get it. So we call this category stupid stuff that adults don't get and we don't understand. And one of these things, for example, is Snapchat streaks, which is an example of which is on the screen. And a Snapchat streak is when I send you a snap and you send me one back. Every consecutive day that we do it, and it has to be consecutive days. You can't miss any dates. Every consecutive day we get another point. And the idea is you begin to want to build up the points. Now, the reason that this goes under stupid stuff is, what do you get for the points? Nothing. You don't get anything for the points. You don't get discounts or gifts or anything like that. It's just kids feel like driven. They get into these Snapchat streaks and they want to keep them going. Other things are things like likes, like how many likes do you get on something? You know, this is a quote from a real girl in our lab who said, you know, sometimes it's 99 and I just want it to get to 100, you know. Why? What is the difference between having 99 likes and 100 likes? Well, there's no difference. Of course, there's no difference, but it feels really important. One of the interesting things was we asked kids how they felt they did in terms of things like likes compared to others in their sort of social groups, so, or in their school. Do you feel like you get as many likes as most of the other kids that you know or that are in your school? And when you ask this kind of question to a subject, you expect to get an answer that falls on what we call a normal curve, where most people tell you they're about average. Some people tell you I get lots more likes. Other people tell you I get fewer, but most people are going to say, yeah, I'm about average. But actually, that's kind of what we got. So what we got was most kids telling us that they think they did worse than their peers in terms of how many likes and hearts and other things they got. Very few kids thought they got more of this than their peers, and not so many kids thought they got about average or the same. Most kids really seem to think they got fewer. And that's really quite striking. I mean, that speaks to like self-esteem and self-confidence. And it seems to be a system where it just doesn't, it doesn't really reinforce kids' sense of their own sort of social success on social media. It doesn't seem to do that. Instead, it really seems to make people feel like they're not quite measuring up. The point here is that the goal of some of these activities, like getting a like or you know, something like that, might feel really fake to adults. It may feel like, who cares how many likes you get? You know, who cares if you get 99 or 100 likes? Why do you obsess about this? Why do you even care about it? And that's a valid question. But the goal may feel fake to us, but the psychological impact is not fake for many kids. And that's the important thing to understand. So kids may engage in things online that feel really silly to us, but it doesn't feel silly to them. And it really seems to have a very real impact on things like depression and anxiety and other things like that. All right. Now let's talk about how often kids tend to become really close to people they meet online, but they don't meet in person. So Leslie, if you don't mind, could you put up the third poll, which is how often do kids form close relationships with people they meet online, but don't know in person? And let's see what you all think. Okay, so how often does this happen? 52% think it happens very often. 36% said some of the time, and 16% said it rarely happens. So it may interest you to know that you're actually overestimating this. Only 17% of kids really report having formed a close relationship with someone that they've never met in person. Only 17%. The other 83% say that they've never had that experience. And I also think that despite the sort of anxiety that adults have about this, kids do seem to be becoming increasingly aware of this. So I do think that that is something of a change. You know, I think we've all seen cases in the news where kids in the past have felt that they've become very close to somebody that they have never met in person. But actually, it does seem like that's becoming more unusual, and kids are becoming more aware of it. So for example, we asked kids, does social media make you more lonely or less lonely? And you can see that only 17% felt that it made them less lonely. Most kids, about 55%, a little more than half, said that it really didn't change anything about their loneliness. But of the kids who felt that social media impacted loneliness, most of them felt that it made them more lonely, not less. Also, does technology make you really close to somebody? So the first thing we asked kids in this study was, we said, does technology make you feel connected to somebody in the moment? So like when you're actually interacting with them in that moment, do you feel like you're connecting with them? And you can see that this was definitely true. Kids definitely felt like technology made them feel that. But then we said, apart from that feeling connected in the moment, does technology make you lead to a really, truly close relationship with somebody? And look at that. It was the opposite. It was the opposite. So technology didn't really make people feel like it led to a close relationship overall. And you can see that only a small portion of the kids felt like technology can make you feel truly close to somebody. There's a question, let's see, from Cody. Is there a possibility that the numbers are skewed because kids don't want their parents to know? Well, if we were asking this in a way that it could get back to their parents, I would agree. But the thing is that this kind of data is all collected on kids totally anonymously. So not only do their parents not know what they're saying, we don't even know who they are. So there's no way that it would ever get back to anybody. They're answering it sort of totally anonymously. So it's not likely that that would skew the answer. There probably are some kids who answered this kind of research thinking, oh, maybe there's some way my parents could find out. There probably are some, but most kids don't seem to be skewed by this. Okay, so those are some of the ways that technology can interact with feelings. Now, let's look at whether technology changes thoughts, how you actually think. So, is it possible that technology can serve as kind of a distortion in a way? Like, you take in information that normally you might understand or you might see it one way, but then the technology itself, the social media or other things, filter the information so that you understand it in a different way. That is possible. Shayla, I do see your question, but I'm going to just wait on it for 1 minute, okay? Because I might answer it, and we can always get back to it at the end. So what changes perceptions when you're using technology? Do you perceive communications in the same way? So you don't. That's the short answer. You don't perceive things in the same way when you're using technology. So for example, one of the things that obviously changes how you perceive information is just the limitations of technology. So when you're having a conversation in real life, you have all of this information, right? You have the words you use, the grammar, the syntax, the person's facial expression, their body language, how they're dressed communicates something to you. I mean, you don't show up for a job interview in shorts and flip-flops, you wear a suit, you know? Everything communicates some information. Your history with the person determines how much you take what they're saying seriously or whether you understand them. And then the physical surroundings that you're in can actually impact how confidential the conversation can feel. But let's say you're texting with somebody, a lot of that is just gone. A lot of this information is simply gone. It's not there anymore. And so, you know, one of the important ways that technology can change perception is it sort of limits what you understand. It limits how you interpret information. Does this cause overinterpretations online? You bet it does. And we see this quite often. Missing information does it. Now, this is one of the issues that I will say kids are beginning to understand better and better as time goes on. I would say that 10 years ago, the kids that we studied didn't understand it at all. But now they are beginning to understand that there's a lot of data that's missing when you're texting each other. Second thing that changes perceptions is that there are certain things that can happen on technology that can make you feel as though a communication is really private, even when it's not. So, for example, what environment are you in? If you're sitting in the public library, then what you're actually doing online feels quite different than if you're sitting in your living room, in your slippers, you know, with hot cocoa and your puppy dog. Like, everything feels safer. It feels more private. And so in that situation, what we find are kids are much more willing to send things that are high risk or that we might think of as being high risk than if they're sitting in the public library or sitting in school, for example. A second thing that really makes people feel safe, and this is kind of interesting and it's something most people don't think of, is the size of the screen that you're using. So if you're using a really small screen, it can actually make you feel like what you're doing is really private, because it's a situation where the screen feels like it's small enough that nobody can see what you're doing but you. And it doesn't matter that you're actually putting it on Instagram, you know, where obviously everyone can see it, but it feels like it's a lot more private. This was just a study we did. It was kind of an interesting one where we put the same information on different size screens and we asked these subjects, you know, how private is this communication? You can see that the cell phone absolutely was by far the most private one. So what are the situations that seem to increase inappropriate sharing? The first one is when the circumstances feel private. So if you're at home versus being in the library, or if you're using a small screen, that can make you feel like it's private. A second circumstance is when users are really emotional or under the influence, really emotional or under the influence. So if someone's using substances or if someone is really upset, they're much more likely to share things inappropriately. The final thing that really seems to increase inappropriate sharing is peer pressure. So when kids are in a situation where they really want to, they're really getting pushed to do something, then we really begin to see them being much more likely. I would say that the peer pressure angle is more important in early adolescence than it is in later adolescence. So the 13, 14, maybe 15-year-olds seem to be more influenced by peer pressure than the 16, 17, 18-year-olds. Okay, third thing that we know changes perception is the increase in self-focus. And this is sort of an interesting phenomenon. This is the fact that when you and I are talking to each other, even over Zoom, but especially I think when we're in person and we're talking to each other, we both each look at each other. We look at each other's faces, and we're constantly assessing how we're doing. This is unconscious for the most part, but I'm watching you and I'm saying, oh, do they look really bored? You know, is everybody on the Zoom falling asleep or wandering out of the room? I'm looking for feedback and I'm focused on you. You, on the other hand, are focused on me. So you're looking at me and asking the same kinds of things. But if I'm texting you or posting something on social media that I know you'll see later, then you're not there for me to sort of look at you. Like, I can't look at you and assess how things are going. So I might begin to focus on myself more and more. I might say, instead of saying, gee, you know, is Leslie interested in what I'm saying? I might say, am I coming across as funny? Am I coming across as clever? And those kinds of questions sort of lead people to think that way. And when you use technology, you're a little more likely to focus on yourself and a little less likely to focus on the other person. So even kids who are really well behaved, as a result, might do things that are really kooky because they're trying really hard to be funny, or they're trying really hard to impress somebody. Fourth, the repetitive nature of technology. So technology is much more repetitive than talking in person. When you and I talk in person, right, I say something, you say something, I say something, you say something, and then it's gone as soon as we've said it. But if we're texting back and forth, then every time we get a message, the whole thread of the conversation is still there for us to look at. And this can lead to something called cognitive priming. And cognitive priming is an interesting phenomenon. It's actually one we've known about for many decades, but it used to be relatively unusual. But now, because of technology, it's become much more usual. And basically, cognitive priming is when repetition leads sort of a small feeling to grow into a really big feeling. So just to give you an example of this, let's say that I'm on a bus and I'm going to school and I'm mad at my mom for making me wear a sweater. So I text 27 of my girlfriends that I'm upset that my mom made me wear a sweater. 19 of them text me back. And they say things like, oh, I don't blame you, I'd be mad too, that kind of thing. By the time I get off that bus, I'm not just a little annoyed at my mom anymore. Now I'm really mad. And that's the kind of priming effect that we see, where a lot of repetition really makes your emotions become more intense. Okay, 5. Technology can make you feel like you're invisible in a big crowd. You know, there's 3 billion kids online, Mom. Nobody's going to see what I post. That kind of sense. The irony, though, of course, is that kids overwhelmingly interact online with the kids they just left on the school bus. So it's much more local than kids realize. Apps really exploit this sense. They exploit the sense that, you know, you're anonymous, you're one of 3 billion, and nobody's ever going to see what you do. All right, now digital technology also increases some risk-taking. And one of the most obvious ways this is done is through sexting. So sexting is sending nude pictures to a peer. Sometimes it is done between a minor and an adult, in which case it is a much clearer situation. I think the situation that most of us struggle with is when it's done between two minors, like two 15-year-olds or two 16-year-olds are exchanging nude photos. So there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of things that kind of draw you astray. So what I'm going to do today here is I'm just going to summarize for you the basic points of what we know now about sexting. What is it that seems really clear and undisputed? So the first thing is to understand is that sexting is not rare and it's not deviant. By age 18, about half of the subjects in our research have sexted. And you can see that that half has been holding steady since 2017. So it's not like a super rare, unusual behavior that's only engaged in by kids who are really deviant or really emotionally, damaged or really depressed, or there's no evidence for anything like that. That was kind of the original thought, I think, that went out on media about sexting, but it has not been held up in the research. Both males and females sext. Females do it more often, which is unusual, by the way, for risk-taking behavior. But females do it more often. Almost 2/3 of the kids who sext are doing it in the context of a romantic relationship. So somebody they're dating, and they're sort of exploring sexuality with them, or they're sexually active with them. And those are, that seems to be probably the single most common category that kids sext in. Kids don't sext in every relationship, but as teenagers, many of them seem to sext in several. And they don't always sext because they're sexually active, although sometimes those two things go together, but they don't always go together. The second point to understand about sexting is that it's not really about sex. It's really about nudity, and it probably should have been called something else, because sexting makes it sound like it's all about sex, and it's not really. What did kids actually send in the sexts that they sent, in the pictures they sent? What was actually in the picture? And you can see having sex was only 12% of the pictures. Most of the pictures were a picture of a body part or a picture of the whole body. And a very large proportion, about a quarter of them, were actually pictures where the kids were largely clothed. But they were very suggestive, something like that. The third thing to understand about sexting is that some groups are clearly at much higher risk for very bad outcomes than other groups. So it's not the same for all kids. It really does seem to be different for different kids. I think we tend to think, when we think about bad outcomes from sexting, I think one of the difficulties is we tend to look at kids and sort of assume that everybody has bad outcomes because all we ever hear about are bad outcomes. But I'm going to show you the data on outcomes in general, and you'll see that by no means are all outcomes negative, which adults don't always like. But it is what it is. But anyway, some of the kids are clearly at higher risk for bad outcomes. So the first group of kids who are at definite increased risk for bad outcomes are kids who are pressured into sexting. So these could be kids who are pestered into sexting. These could be kids who are bullied into sexting, who are threatened into sexting, that kind of thing. Now, not all kids are pressured, but one of the questions we asked subjects was, is sexting expected? Is it an expected part of relationships today? Now, what this question is really asking is, do you feel pressured by society in general? If you go out with anybody, are you now under pressure to send them a photo? And what you can see is the largest group of kids, about a third of them, actually said there was no agreement on this, that some kids felt like it was expected and other kids didn't. But almost all of the other categories on the slide reflected the belief that it really is an expected part of sexting. So girls are more likely to feel that sexting is expected. Sexting is expected when you date today. And attitudes like, if you don't sext, there's something wrong with you, or your boyfriend or your girlfriend might go out with someone else if you don't sext. So I think all of this data really suggests that there is a certain amount of expectation and pressure put on all kids to sext today. Having said that, clearly, half of them are not doing it. But having said that, I think we do have to think about the pressure and the expectations and working with kids about on that. Females were significantly more likely to be pressured than males, almost twice as likely. And this is really, really consistent and running in parallel with sexuality in general during adolescence. Females experience much more pressure to be sexual during adolescence than males do. And sexting now just seems to be another one of these sexual behaviors that girls are more pressured to engage in. Now, when I first sort of woke up to this fact that pressure was part of sexting, I was very concerned about it. And I saw it as a very serious form of harassment or cyberbullying. But I also perceived pressure as being always negative. And it turns out that in that, I was actually wrong. I was wrong to think of it that way. A certain number of subjects also report to us what they consider positive pressure. Positive pressure is when somebody asks you to send a nude photo, but they do it in a way that's kind of flattering. So for example, somebody asks really nicely, and so it's sort of flattering, or somebody you're dating or somebody who's in love with you really wants a photo, and it doesn't feel nasty at all. It feels flattering. And I think it's really important to acknowledge this, because if we always talk about pressure as being horrible and negative, then we're not going to reach the kids who are experiencing sort of quote unquote positive pressure. This is how pressure sort of panned out in the 2019 data. So you can see that about 30% of the kids said there was no pressure of any kind. About 36% said they experienced only positive pressure. 17% said they experienced only negative pressure, and about another 16% said it was mixed, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. So actually positive pressure was more common than negative pressure. That doesn't mean, I'm not suggesting that it was better or acceptable, but pressure that was experienced as positive by the subject. The type of pressure is strongly associated with the degree of pressure. So when kids reported experiencing very heavy pressure, a lot of pressure, it was much, much more likely to be negative. And when the pressure was kind of light, like maybe one request and then they gave up or something, it was much more likely to be experienced as positive. So pressure is nuanced and it's kind of complicated, but regardless, I think that pressure, whether it's intended or experienced as positive or negative, I think that pressure has to be seen as like a red flag. It has to be seen as something that's wrong to do to people and wrong to have done to you. The second at-risk group are the kids who sext really young. So in our research, many, in fact, really most sexters actually sent a sext before age 18 while they were still a minor. So there weren't many kids who sent nude photos who began sending them at age 18 or 19. Most of them actually sent photos younger than 18 or 19. And around 10 to 15% send their first photo age 14 or younger. So they're in middle school at that point. One of the things that we found is that there's a big association between pressure and how old you are when you send your first photo. So this is positive pressure in different age groups. And you can see that actually the positive pressure is a little more common as the kids get older. But look at the negative pressure. The negative pressure are the green bars. And you can see that it's really the younger kids, the middle schoolers, the high school freshmen and sophomores who experience far more pressure and far more negative pressure overall. So partly this is kind of a developmental issue, but I think it's really, really important as an issue to talk about pressure, because pressure is pretty strongly associated with bad outcomes. And we're going to talk about outcomes in a minute. Let's talk. There's one more at-risk group for bad outcomes, and that is LGBTQ youth. So these kids are clearly at high risk for poor outcomes. They come into school and into adolescence typically already kind of compromised. They have higher rates of depression and anxiety. They tend to have less social support. They tend to feel that if they're targeted, adults won't help them. And they come in sort of more vulnerable to begin with. Overall, the LGBTQ males showed the highest rate of sexting in middle school. So when you look at middle school sexting, the LGBTQ males show the highest rate. The females didn't show quite as high a rate as the males. LGBTQ youth are also more likely to sext with non-dates. So they're more likely to sext with people they're not dating, which I think is a pretty safe barometer of risk. It's clearly going to be much riskier to sext with strangers or people you don't know or you're not in a relationship with versus sexting with somebody you're dating. I think that's pretty clear. Now, we have a lot of data on LGBTQ youth and sexting. We did a whole project on that last year. I don't have time to go through it all today, but it does seem pretty clear that LGBTQ youth are definitely one of the high-risk groups that tend to have worse outcomes. And it's good to understand that some kids are more likely to have worse outcomes than others. Okay. Let's talk about risk. Are we talking about risk in the right way? So this is actually really important because how we talk about risk with kids kind of determines how credible we are. So we've all seen really scary anecdotes, where sexting is associated with suicide, other terrible headlines. And that may make us feel like those are likely outcomes. Most kids we study tell us that when it comes to sexting education, there are two main messages that they tend to hear from adults. One message is, if you sext, you're going up the river. It's illegal, it's child pornography, it's a felony, you're going to be prosecuted, your life's going to be over, you're never going to get a job, you're never going to get into college, those kinds of things. The other thing they tend to hear from adults tends to be a warning about how if you sext, it's going to ruin your social life, that other people are always going to see it. It always gets out and, it's going to be, you're just going to be wrecked. So how often do kids experience these kinds of outcomes, either for themselves or for their friends? How often do they see kids get into legal trouble? How often do they see kids who sext have ruined social lives? So it turns out not very often. So about 80% of the teenagers we've studied say that they know kids who have sexted. And of that 80%, 65% said they sexted and they saw no serious problems as a result. So that's a real issue because it really seems like we are warning kids about these behaviors that they don't see happen. And the conclusion that kids tend to come to is that adults really don't know what they're talking about. And that means that we can't educate them about real risk. And there is real risk in sexting, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Detection is really low in sexting. Less than 10% of the cases are ever detected by an adult. Almost all of them go undetected, which is one of the reasons why problems are very rare. When we asked kids how often their pictures were seen or posted widely by others, only 13% said that it happened to them. And there are very few kids that are being prosecuted for these now. Prosecutions that do happen tend to involve things like adults sexting with kids, or coercive or bullying associated with sexting, or unauthorized distribution. Those cases tend to be prosecuted. Others are not, generally speaking. Now, you might think that 13% of pictures being posted widely is a huge underestimate, like maybe, we're just completely missing the mark. I just want to show you, the Pew Research found that only 7% of the kids who sexted said that there was unauthorized distribution. So whether it's 7% or 13%, I actually don't think is important, but here's what I do think is important. I think if we say to kids that all photos get out eventually and that everyone's going to see it, kids know that that's not true. They know that that's not what happens. And I think it's really important to be accurate. Okay, one of the final points I want to make here is that it's really important to understand that kids see sex and nudity on social media as having good outcomes, not bad outcomes, not just bad outcomes. So outcomes can be negative, but most often what we find is outcomes were either positive or they were kind of mixed. Only 19% of sexters said they only had negative outcome. Notice that 22% of them had no outcomes. Nothing happened. They sent the photo and nothing happened. Nothing bad, nothing good. 27% said they only had positive outcomes, and 32%, that's the biggest group, said they had mixed. They had some positive, some negative. Now, one of the questions I often get from adults is, what are the positive outcomes? What are these positive outcomes? So I'm going to show you. I'll show you the negative ones too. But first, let's look at the positive outcomes. What do you get when you sext that's a positive outcome? You don't become more popular overall, and you don't get a new boyfriend or girlfriend. Those are the things that we thought were going to be really important. It turned out they were really unimportant. Kids talked about feeling more self-confident and feeling better looking. They talked about becoming closer in their relationship. Remember, most sexting is happening in the context of a relationship. And they talked about sexting as sort of a good way to explore sexuality, better than, parking in somebody's car, for example. Okay, so those are the three outcomes that were the most positive. A lot of kids reported positive emotions while they were actually sexting. So a lot of them said things like, I felt emotionally safe. I felt like I could be honest and creative. I felt emotionally attached to the person. So that wasn't all sexters by any means, but it was about 63% said things like that. Now, what about the bad things that happen? Because there definitely are bad things. So let's look first at the bad things we warn kids about. How often do sexters have social problems with peers, problems with parents? How often is the picture passed around? How often has it impacted opportunities, like it's gotten in the way of your getting a job or getting into college? And you notice that these numbers are all really low. Now, this doesn't mean that when somebody's 35 years old, a picture they took back when they were 16 couldn't impact a job application. I'm not saying that. Remember, this data is collected largely on 18-year-olds. So they have plenty of time to mess up their lives. They're not through that yet. But my point is that you can see when you're trying to educate teenagers about the risks of sexting, we're warning them about risks that they are very unlikely to have either experienced or to know anybody who has experienced. On the other hand, look at the emotional bad outcomes. Those were really common. So feeling anxious or embarrassed or depressed, those bad outcomes were really significant. And so if we talk to kids about things that can go wrong if they sext, I think we would be much more on target to talk about emotional risks, to say things like, you know, you might not feel so good about this. You really have to think about that. Furthermore, we asked kids who were about 3 months out from sending a photo if their feelings had changed since they sent the photo. And what we found was about half the kids said their feelings didn't change. But of the kids whose feelings changed, about 2/3 of them said that their feelings changed for the worse. So they actually began to feel more negative after sending the photo. So how are we going to use this data to talk to kids? One of the interesting things we did is we went back and we looked at what the best sort of evidence-based approach was to talking about sex in general with teenagers, and if the approach to talking about teenage sex could be used when it comes to talk about sexting. So for example, understand the risks. Understand the risks. Some of them are potentially quite serious. That doesn't mean that you're going to see kids dragged off in handcuffs from your high school. But it doesn't mean it can't happen either. There are some risks that are really serious that might be very rare. What's the relationship like between you and this person? How well do you know them? What's going on between you two? And what's the context? Are they pressuring you or pushing you into doing this? Pay attention to how you're feeling about doing it and think about how you're going to feel afterwards. And don't be pressured. Do not be pressured into sexting, and don't pressure other people. I think that's an incredibly important part of this. What about tech problems in general? How do we talk to kids about them? So the dangers of technology, whether you're thinking about cyberbullying or whether you're thinking about sexting, the dangers are real, but we really have to focus on how common or how frequent they are. Let me give you an example. If you're going to take kids and let them, let's say you're going to let kids roam around a city by themselves. You could say to them, watch out when you cross the street, look both ways to see if a car is coming. Don't assume cars are going to stop. That would be a very reasonable kind of thing. They're going to see cars, right? They're definitely going to see cars. They're going to see cars that don't stop. They're going to see cars that zip by. And people get hit by cars every day. So that's not a rare thing. But what if you were taking kids into the city and you said to them, be careful because when you leave the building, you could get struck by lightning. Now, excuse me, lightning is not false. It's very real. People do get struck by lightning, but it's incredibly unusual. Odds are you don't know anybody who's been struck by lightning, and the kids don't know anybody who's ever been struck by lightning. But if all you ever said to kids was, watch out for the lightning, watch out for the lightning, watch out for the lightning, you know, kids would conclude that you really don't understand what you're talking about. So a risk can be real, but rare. And if we treat it as though it's common, then what begins to happen is kids begin to conclude that we really don't know what we're talking about. And now they're not talking to us about these issues. Another thing to really think about is you don't want to miss the frequent problems because you're focusing on the rare problems. So if you're focusing on kids getting into trouble with their parents because of sexting, you're missing the very frequent problems, which is that, hey, you might feel lousy after doing it. And that is a real and much more common problem than getting into trouble with your parents. It's really important too not to be distracted by technology. So don't, in other words, when a problem happens technologically, it's not always about the technology. So if you have a situation, just as an example, where a girl has been pushed or pressured or bullied into sexting, and you're lecturing her about the danger of putting photos, nude photos online, you're kind of missing the point. The point is not so much the digital part, which is one element to be sure, but the real point is what's going on with this girl where other people are pestering her, pushing her, bullying her into doing something like this, and she's giving into it. Like, where is her social support? Who can she go to for help when she has these problems? And it's just really important not to sort of miss the forest for the trees. And I think sometimes when technology is involved, adults like rush to that. Finally, we really need to be credible sources of information for kids. When we're thinking about their social relationships and how they're growing up socially, bullying and risk-taking online, we really have to know what we're talking about. And so to do that, we really have to follow the research. And not go by things like media headlines, which are not inaccurate, but they can be incredibly misleading. So I think it's really important to do that. Okay, this is contact information, and you can get in touch with me or our center. We have a lot of resources. I really encourage you to take advantage of them. Almost all of them are completely free. We have surveying, online needs assessment. We can help you do surveys for free with all your students or with parents in your community, with other professionals. We have free curricula, one for K through 5, a middle school and a high school curriculum. These are all research-based curricula. They're free for anybody. We have train the trainer workshops where we can certify you as a trainer. You can put those together with your organization. We have all kinds of programming. We speak to parents, all kinds of things. So please avail yourself of these resources. Now, if anybody else has any questions, I would be happy to take them. We have about 5 minutes. I think what's going to happen is that you're going to ask them on Connects, and Leslie is going to type them into the box. So one question from Shayla is, are there differences in different age groups, like teens and youth under 13? I would say there's definitely differences. So one of the big things that we see that's different is that kids who are younger are just sort of less developed in their savviness about how to handle social relationships and problems like sexting pressure. They're less likely to seek help from friends or from adults. And they're just less likely to know what to do and how to sort of build resilience. Once kids get to about 17 or 18, they begin to really understand how to build resilience. And the way to do that, as I mentioned earlier, is to really rally support of friends and family. I think it's really, really important to understand that. So kids under 13, generally speaking, are just at higher risk for all kinds of digital problems that we see. Everything seems to get a little better after about age 15. That's not to say that problems with behaviors that are illegal necessarily stop. But once you get over 15, what you see is kids tend to be a little bit more settled in their peer relationships, and they tend to be they tend to know who to turn to, and they've been through enough at that point through their adolescence that they have a better sense of how to handle problems. Are there any other questions? Lots of likes, so that's good. We have a lot of resources. I really encourage you to go look at our website and take a look. We really do a lot for places all over the country. We could help you survey students. This fall and winter may be incredibly important. One of the things I will say that we've seen in schools this fall and winter is that schools, certainly in the Northeast, tend to have fewer students at school, and so they've seen reductions in in-person bullying, but cyberbullying does seem to be a really serious problem. A question from Kenzie: is there any correlation between divorce or domestic violence at home and sexting and cyberbullying? Yes, there is a correlation between violence at home, not so much divorce, but violence at home, absolutely. It makes kids less resilient, and it makes kids more likely to engage in bullying and cyberbullying. So yes, there is an association. Bullying and cyberbullying are really forms of abusiveness, and so it makes sense that domestic abusiveness would be correlated with that, I think. Any other questions? We have 3 minutes. Oh, you know, one thing I could point out, Kenzie, too, is that family support is associated with less bullying and cyberbullying. So for example, one of the things we studied was we did a study where we asked kids about involvement in bullying and cyberbullying, and we asked them about whether they ever ate dinner with their families. Kids who ate dinner 3 nights a week or more often with their families were less likely to get involved in bullying and cyberbullying. And this was true even among kids whose families fought all the time at the dinner table, which I thought was very funny. They said, even the kids who said, oh yeah, we have teenagers and everybody fights every dinner, even those kids were less likely to get involved in bullying and cyberbullying. Thank you, appreciate the info, great info. I'm so glad everybody found it was valuable. And everyone have a wonderful day and a great time at the conference. I hope you get lots of interesting information, and be sure to contact me if there is anything I can do for any of you or your schools or your groups, communities, government groups, or anything else. Have a great day. Thanks again.